Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Protection and Indemnity Insurance webinar. Today is the 12th of November 2020 and this is the first in our winter series of webinars. I'm going to talk this afternoon about probably one of the most misunderstood coverages in marine, protection and indemnity, usually abbreviated P&I insurance. What is it? Well, it's a bit like auto liability, it's a bit like a GL policy. It's the liability arising out of the ownership, use or operation of a watercraft. Pretty simple there. But there's a second part of it which is unusual to this particular field, and that is the workers' compensation type of element. It's not that it actually covers workers' compensation, but it does provide the Jones Act and the other admiralty remedies to various crew members. And we'll discuss that more in a different seminar. In the US market today, there are three common forms in use. The SP23, originally written back in the 50s, was updated last in 1983, almost 40 years ago now. SP38, written in 1955, now nearly 65 years old. And the AIMU P&I clauses, again written on most updated in 83. So these are not modern forms, they've been in use for many years, and each of them has a specific use, and many underwriters prefer one of the three, sometimes to the benefit of the client, sometimes not. There's not huge differences between the three forms, but we are going to go through those differences and explain what they are. But it's worth thinking about the SP23 as really being designed for ocean-going vessels. That doesn't mean it's used exclusively for that, but its original design was for that. Whereas the 38 had been called a coastwise form, more for the tug and barge operations, doesn't have some of the broad coverages that the 38 does, and the AIMU form fits somewhere in between. So what do? We indemnify the owner. So this is one of the biggest changes when you move from a GL type of policy to a P&I policy, is it's not pay on behalf of, these are indemnity policies. As owner of the vessel, now an owner could be a charterer, and there's a few other ways you could be liable, but the P&I policy itself is as owner or charterer, it's an implied addition to the vessel. And the three wordings are not significantly different. All loss or damage or expense herein set forth. You can see that was written in the 50s. Any sums which the insured liable on account of, and subject to all exclusions and other terms, any sums which the insured liable as ship owner entitled. Again, they're using this word ship owner, but obviously it applies to any type of watercraft. So one of the most important parts of the P&I form is the bodily injury part. Loss of life, injury and illness. And all three of them provide coverage to just about anybody who has bodily injury in its natural stage. The SP38 has built into it an exclusion for any claim under longshore or workers' comp. AIMU words it slightly differently, excludes employees under longshore or workers' comp. SP23 in its natural form doesn't have those words, but it does exclude employees under compensation acts. On the flip side, it specifically provides liability for stevedores handling cargo. That's a 903B action for those of you in longshore. It's a very specific ability for a stevedore to file suit against their employer whilst unloading a vessel. So loss of life to whom? Passengers is probably the most logical one. Could be passengers on your vessel. Could be people on another vessel. They could be passengers or crew. You run into another vessel, injure people, injure the crew or injure passengers on that other vessel. That's all on that loss of life or injury claim, the bodily injury section. People on the land or on the dock, and of course crew. All three of these forms in their natural state include coverage for crew. Having said that, underwriters often will take that away by restricting the coverage and adding an exclusion for crew. In some cases, a limitation for crew, no more than 5 crew at any one time, might be a wording that you'd see used. Some carriers will actually require you to name crew, and that to me is a real problem. Let's say you have Captain Jones, and today Captain Jones gets sick, and you have to call on somebody else to replace him. You've got to change that name on the policy to get coverage for this new captain. One carrier we deal with will allow you to say, or any direct substitute thereof. So it allows for that temporary substitution of a captain. But some are very strict on just allowing named crew. So if you're a crewman, what can you get? It's not just the Jones Act, but it's 5 different types of remedies available to you. Maintenance and cure, unseaworthiness, the Jones Act, the Death on the High Seas Act, and wrongful death. And let's have a quick look through each one of these. Maintenance and cure of maintenance is food and lodging. It's the actual expenditure of food and lodging until the maximum recovery of the injured crewman. And cure is medical services. Really any reasonable medical expenses. Could be things like air ambulance evacuation. It could be actual hospital care or outpatient care. Anything in the medical field falls into the cure expensive. Maintenance is just worth spending a little moment on. It's usually a fixed rate, $30, $40, $50 per day. It varies from different parts of the country. Check with your adjuster to find out what the local one is if you're not familiar with it. But failure to pay maintenance and cure is a really bad thing to happen, and is one of the few cases where today you can still get punitive damages levied against the insured for failure to pay maintenance and cure. You need to be paying maintenance on an injured crewman regardless of fault. Doesn't mean you were liable, you just pay that $30, $40, $50 a day until they get to their maintenance recovery. Again, regardless of any fault or liability. The second cause of action is unseaworthiness. Now this doesn't literally mean the ship would sink, but the vessel has to have some defective part. It could be in the hull, it could be in the cargo handling, it could be simply in the equipment, hand tools, ropes, tackle, and provisions. The competency and size of the crew. If you get injured because there should have been 8 crewmen aboard and there were only 6, that could be a claim for unseaworthiness. In one particular case, handling equipment was the problem, in that the person was injured by a winch that was no longer protected. Somebody had removed the protective cover from the winch. Even down to one claim for unseaworthiness because the fishing boat had a fish on its foredeck and the injured crewman slipped on that fish. I think that's a stretch and it was never taken to court, but that is at least a cause for an unseaworthiness claim to be made. Probably the most notorious of these benefits is the Jones Act. It's not really called the Jones Act, it's really called the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. It's 100 years old this year, and allows a seaman to sue his employer for injury or illness suffered while in the course of his employment due to the negligence of the employer. Back in 1920, this was set up to be a negligence action, something the employer, the ship owner, the vessel owner, did wrong, allowed the seaman to sue. But over the 100 years of court cases, this has been termed a featherlight standard. And it's now more on the on the employer's side that they have to defend and say there was no negligence. And there is almost a presumption of negligence just because that crewman is on a vessel. You've got to provide them with a reasonably safe place to work. And it's absolute, and you can't delegate it even if you don't own the vessel. This becomes a real problem when you put somebody one of your employees, on somebody else's vessel. So, for example, a concessionaire aboard a cruise ship, you're still required to make sure that that cruise ship is a safe place to work, even though you may not own that cruise ship or operate it. The Death on the High Seas Act starts outside the territorial waters of the United States, which is effectively 12 nautical miles outside the US, about 13.5 land miles. This applies to both seamen and non-seamen, and is monetary damages. There's no punitives allowed on death on the high seas. So again, on the high seas means beyond that 12 nautical mile limit. If somebody dies, you have that potential Death on the High Seas Act action. Strangely enough, it took till 1970 for general maritime law to take in a wrongful death action. This is the mirror image of the death on the high seas in that it applies only within the US territorial waters, 12 nautical miles. Now, we haven't quite found out what would happen if somebody died right on that line between 12 nautical miles offshore. Would it be wrongful death or death on the high seas? I suspect the attorney would just allege both and take it from there. The next coverage is damage to other vessels or property on board caused by collision. Here we run into another vessel. Tugboat, barge, crew boat, cruise ship, doesn't really matter. But that physical damage to the other vessel is covered by this clause. Some policies call it a running down clause. Most call it a collision liability clause. And the primary coverage is typically covered under the hull policy, up to the limit of the hull. Now this gets a little confusing, and we're actually going to do a completely separate webinar on how you jigsaw collision and, for that matter, towers liability together. But for the purpose of this webinar, just understand that you get under the 23 and the 38, you get coverage that wraps around the P&I, the hull policy, The P&I wraps around the hull policy. So if, for example, you had a $700,000 hull and $1 million P&I, you get $300,000 excess coverage in the P&I policy. The AIMU P&I form does exclude this, but it's added back in by endorsement very freely. Again, we're doing a separate webinar on this. It will be just into the 2021 year on Wednesday the 6th of January. It's already posted, so if you want to sign up as to how to properly structure collision and towers liability, it'll be on that Wednesday 6th of January webinar. So the next coverage is damage to other vessels or property not caused by collision. All three forms really give you that coverage. The AIMU has an exclusion for nuclear and pollution damage. But really the biggest question is, how would you damage another vessel without causing collision? The biggest one is wake or wave wash. You plough your vessel down the channel and suddenly the wake or wave wash washes somebody in from the shore or swamps another boat. You can be liable for that wake or wave wash if you're performing in excess speed. And so that liability falls on this section of the P&I policy. You could do a thing called taking the channel, forcing another vessel to run aground to avoid a collision. Now, you didn't collide with them, so it's not collision liability, but their damage running aground to avoid colliding with your vessel can be your liability. Two other most common coverages under here will be fire and explosion. If your vessel catches fire or if your vessel explodes and damages the next vessel without colliding with it, then again this section would come into play. And it's part of your P&I policy automatically. Damage to docks, piers, often called fixed and floating objects. We run into a dock, we run into a pier, we have a breakaway that runs into a bridge. Again, all three policies include this coverage. You'll hear this referred to as an elision. That's not a typo up there. Elision is the collision with a fixed office, a fixed item, a dock, a pier, or buoy, or anything like that. Whereas a collision is restricted to another vessel. And these are common terms in the marine world. So if you're dealing with marine clients, you need to know the difference between the collision and the allision. Again, allision to docks, piers, and other fixed and floating objects. Wreck removal is again in all three forms, not limited by the insured vessel, but is required to be compulsory by law and not already covered by the whole policy in the 23. The 38 just includes that removal of wreck. AMU generously gives you attempts to remove as well, so even if you fail, that coverage is included. Cargo is naturally in the SP23 form. The 38 excludes cargo, and the AMU form mirrors that same 38 exclusion. Having said that, most underwriters who write the 23 will initially exclude cargo unless you specifically request that coverage. The 38 and the AIMU forms both add back cargo relatively easily if that coverage is required. This is typically a matter of underwriting and paying either an additional premium or a larger premium to include that cargo coverage. Customs fines or customs, immigration, or other penalties and fines, again, all three of them provide that same inclusion for this coverage. Cargo's proportion of general average, this mirrors the coverage form, and the SP23, of course, provides cargo liability naturally. So again, it includes that cargo proportion of general average. The 38 and the AIMU forms do not include that, but again, that can be brought back by endorsement. I'm not going to sit and read through these different definitions. There's not a lot to do difference between the three forms here. But I think probably the most important part on the liability is what is called an aggregate limit. SP23 and SP28 talk about an aggregate limit, but it's the aggregate of all claims within that one event, that one occurrence. It's not an aggregate that lasts forever, and it's only for the one event. So you can have multiple claims during the year which contribute to the gross aggregate, each one getting its own. If, for example, you've got $1 million limit and you have 5 claims in the year, you have $1 million to spend 5 times. But it does take all the parts of the P&I clause and adds it together to one combined single limit. The AMU form uses that term, combined single limit, and I think that's more accurate than the aggregate in the SP23 form. Deductibles. Deductibles are very common in the P&I form, but the SP23 does not actually allow for it. In the policy, you actually have to add it by a separate endorsement. The 38 and the AIMU forms both have places for deductible, one for bodily injury and one for property damage. And lastly, the various endorsements. We don't have time this afternoon to go through every one of them, but let's just talk a little bit about them. Pollution exclusion and buyback, that's a limited liability policy. Obviously, you have pollution coverage such as OPA coverage if you have a real pollution exposure. Radioactive contamination, again, very common exclusion. Punitive damages, again, most common today. Not an issue for most types of claims except that failure to pay maintenance and cure. Automatic acquisition clause. I think this can be misleading sometimes. Let's say you've got a fleet of tugs or barges where the maximum is 500,000 any one vessel. Most often that automatic acquisition clause caps the automatic acquisition at 500,000. So if you acquire that new tug or barge the next week, which is 700,000, you've only got 500,000 of potential coverage. Excess collision liability, excess towers liability, again, where that's excluded in the basic form, it can be bought back. Navigation warranty, inland and coastal waters of, how far offshore can you go? Okay, make sure that you communicate those to the insured. Swimming and diving exclusions are pretty common, particularly for recreational vessels or passenger vessels. Anybody that carries people that could be swimming or diving. TRIA, I think, is pretty obvious. In personam liability allows the suit against the person to be treated like an in rem suit, a suit against the vessel. Clearly adding a schedule of vessels. And remember, P&I only covers vessels that are actually scheduled. If it's not on the schedule, it's not covered. So if you have a big boat with a small tender, are you naming that tender separately? Are you listing it under your P&I policy? Additional insureds, tankerman's liability. Are you using the vessels to fuel, provide water, diesel oil, anything like that to another vessel? That's tankerman's. A dredge clause can limit the liability from the specialist operations of a dredge. If the dredge is running around and collides with another vessel, you've got the coverage. But if in the course of dredging and you have this dredge clause in there, it can potentially take out the damage caused by the actual dredging itself. Now you've got to watch out for this dredge clause because it can be different from carrier to carrier. So it's important if you see a dredge clause on a policy with a dredge listed to make sure you know exactly what it does or does not cover. Crew warranty and named crew we've talked about already. A combined single limit. Typically it's in there already, but some people like to add it by endorsement. And last, excuse me, voluntary wreck removal. The P&I coverage itself gives you compulsory wreck, where an order's been issued by the Coast Guard or somebody else. This extends it to give you voluntary wreck removal. There are three other types of P&I forms which we're not going to get into today. One is when you're building the risk, building the new vessel, the yacht or the ship in this case. The builder's risk policy does include limited amount of P&I in that policy. Club rules. This is an entry in one of the P&I mutuals. And we're going to do another webinar on the P&I mutuals down the road a little bit, which will explain how their coverage is a slightly different form than the ones we've just talked about today. And the last is recreational boat and yacht forms. There are literally hundreds of these and every one of them is different. So it's impossible to really study exactly what each one's covered because of the diversity of them. But they all have the same elements of coverage as the P&I forms we've looked at today. Most of them will naturally exclude crew but require a buyback, but there are a few that will automatically include crew. Unfortunately, the only way to know what you got in one of those policies is to look at the specific policy and analyse it from there.